A scream bursts out like a primal reflex. Yeah! It is not merely a sound that opens a song, but a signal of power, of absolute dominance over tens of thousands of people screaming back in response. Stadium lights blaze, the air grows thick. Music is no longer a melody. It becomes a mass of energy forced straight into the listener's chest. At the center of that storm stands James Hetfield, the leader of Metallica, the biggest metal band in the world. For more than 4 decades, his voice has been regarded as the very definition of anger in popular music. Anger forged into riffs, held tight by iron discipline, screamed out like a ritual of survival. But the stage tells only half the story, because there is a paradox that has always existed alongside that scream. A man who can roar before the entire world, yet does not know how to speak about his own emotions. Behind the image of hardened masculinity, behind the authority of leadership, still lies an emotional void formed very early on, a place where silence was not a choice, but a rule. This story does not begin with Metallica. It does not begin with thrash metal. It does not begin with success or fame. It begins with a childhood where emotions were never named, where pain was not allowed to surface, where weakness was seen as a moral failure rather than a human condition. In that world, silence was considered a virtue. Discipline was placed above compassion, and belief, not emotion, was the only thing permitted to lead the way. Music, later on, became an escape, not to heal immediately, but to survive. This is not just the story of a band built on anger. This is the story of a man who learned to scream as loudly as possible to conceal the fact that he had no language for his pain. And the journey ahead is not a journey to conquer the world, but a journey inward, to learn how to feel the things that were once forced into silence. James Hetfield was born in 1963 in Downey, California, a quiet suburban town where every house looks the same, where order and conformity are seen as signs of a proper life. But inside the Hetfield household, that order did not bring a sense of safety. It brought silence. James's family followed Christian Science, a strict belief system in which modern medicine is viewed with suspicion and illness is regarded as a test of faith. In that environment, pain is not analyzed, not questioned with a why. It must be endured. Seeking medical help is not merely seen as unnecessary, it is considered a sign of insufficient faith. From an early age, James learned an unspoken lesson. Emotions are not something to express, they are something to control. When his father left, there was no conversation to explain it, no moment of closure, only disappearance. One day, the man was simply no longer there, and life continued as if there were nothing that needed to be said. James was not asked how he felt, nor was he taught how to ask that question of himself. Then came an irreversible loss. James's mother developed cancer. In another family, this would have been a moment of hospitals, diagnoses, and fragile hope. But in the Hetfield household, there was no such option. Religious belief required her to refuse medical treatment. No chemotherapy, no surgery, no intervention, only prayer and prolonged waiting. When she died, James was still a teenager. At an age when emotions need guidance, he was forced to face death in its coldest form. No healing rituals, no space for collapse. Grief was not allowed to spill outward. It had to be held inside, as something to be overcome in silence. In that world, crying was not release. it was failure. At school, James increasingly felt that he belonged nowhere. His family was different. The rules he carried were different. And most importantly, the way he handled emotions was different. While other children could rebel, grow angry, or seek comfort, James stood apart, watching, withdrawing, not because he lacked emotion, but because he had no language for it. Feelings were compressed layer by layer. Sadness was replaced with discipline. Confusion was covered over with self-control. It was precisely in that void that music entered, not as a choice, but as a necessity for survival. The guitar did not require James to explain how he felt. It did not judge belief, and it did not demand right or wrong. Sound allowed him to speak the things that everyday life did not permit him to acknowledge. There, anger could exist. Sadness could resonate. Chaos could be allowed to surface. Music became the only place where James could be honest, without having to say a single word. But that repression never truly disappeared. It was only postponed, carefully stored deep inside. And when it finally found a way out, it would not emerge as tears. It would emerge as a storm. By the late 1970s, Los Angeles was crowded with bands chasing the spotlight. But James Hetfield was not looking for a stage. He was looking for an escape. And that escape appeared in a form as simple as it was brutal. A small classified ad in a newspaper, placed by Lars Ulrich, seeking a guitarist to pursue music that was faster, louder, and required permission from no one. That meeting was not built on compatible personalities. It was forged by a shared source of raw energy, frustration. When in 1981, Metallica was born, not as an artistic project with a long-term plan, but as a chain reaction. Thrash metal became their language. High-speed, sharp-edged, unforgiving, without mercy, without compassion. There was no room for hesitation, no space for weakness. For James, this was the first time his anger took on a clear shape. It was no longer something compressed in silence. It was organized, disciplined, transformed into musical structure. The early albums emerged like manifestos. To Kill 'Em All was not merely a shocking title. It reflected the mindset of a generation unwilling to compromise. Ride the Lightning went deeper, darker, revealing that anger was not only directed outward, but also turned inward. And then Master of Puppets arrived, a work of chilling completeness, where control and fury merged, where power no longer erupted but became a system. During this period, James gradually formed his public persona. He was not just the voice or the riff writer. He became the one who controlled the emotional tempo of the entire band. Discipline was placed above all else. Mistakes were not tolerated. Harshness was not a personal choice. It was a defense mechanism. If everything was tightly controlled, emotions would have no chance to break through. Then the accident happened. The death of Cliff Burton in 1986 was an immeasurable shock. But there was no time to collapse. The schedule continued. Albums still had to be promoted. The band still had to survive. In the world Metallica was entering, weakness was not seen as a necessary phase. It was a threat. James did not allow himself to stop. The pain was not processed. It was pressed deeper, then locked away. In its place came more control, more rigidity, leadership through distance and severity. Anger was no longer just creative fuel. It became armor. Gradually, anger ceased to be a reaction to the world. It became a public persona. It became a brand. It became what audiences expected and what James was forced to maintain. Metallica was built on anger, and James Hetfield, step by step, learned how to live inside that role, even as it began to consume the real person behind it. 1991 marked an irreversible turning point. Metallica released the Black Album, a work calculated with cold precision, in which anger was sharpened to become more accessible, heavier, and more universal. Metallica was no longer just the voice of an underground community. They stepped directly into the center of global popular culture. Enter Sandman filled the radio waves. Nothing Else Matters appeared in places where metal had never been welcomed. For the first time, metal became mainstream without apology. At the center of that shift stood James Hetfield. On stage, he embodied an American model of masculinity, strong, controlled, unshakable. His voice was deep and solid, his stance steady like a pillar. To the public, James was not just a band leader. He was a symbol of hardness, of a kind of strength that required no explanation. But power always carries its weight. As Metallica became a global machine, James's role changed as well. When he was no longer just the riff writer or the voice, he became the one responsible for keeping everything from collapsing. Schedules, stages, sound, discipline, and the band's public image. Control was no longer a reflex, it became an obligation. The problem was this: control does not resolve emotions, it only postpones them. Behind the lights, alcohol began to appear as a familiar tool, not for partying, but for numbing, for keeping things without language buried. Emotional communication remained a foreign territory. James could command a stadium, yet stumble when it came to expressing how he felt to the people standing beside him every day. The greater the success, the heavier the pressure. The heavier it became, the thicker the armor of toughness. What had once helped James survive, hardness, control, the refusal to allow himself to collapse, now began to work against him. It was no longer a strategic choice. It became a psychological burden, a role he could not step out of, because the entire world was watching. Metallica had conquered the world, but elsewhere, deep inside their leader, a silent conflict was building, and it could not be resolved with riffs or with screams, because not all pressure can be pushed outward. Some things, sooner or later, turn back inward. At a certain point, alcohol was no longer a post-tour habit. It became a system, a way to release pressure, a way not to feel. For James Hetfield, control on stage was always absolute, but off stage, things began to fracture. Alcoholism escalated quietly, yet steadily. Recording sessions grew tense. The atmosphere in rehearsal rooms thickened with defensiveness. Communication was no longer an exchange. It became confrontation. Stirred relationships with Lars Ulrich and Kirk Hammett gradually turned into silent power struggles. No one spoke directly about emotions, but everyone felt them. James, the man who once kept everything in order through iron discipline, began to tighten his grip even further. And when control is tightened too much, every structure risks breaking. In 2001, James entered rehab, not as a gentle choice, but as a necessity. His absence sent the band into instability. Metallica had never existed without its center. Yet James's presence at that moment was no longer sustainable either. Anger, the force that once drove everything, now turned inward. It was no longer released through riffs. It found its way into silence, into self-criticism, into distance. When James returned, the process of rebuilding was not only musical, it was therapeutic. For the first time, the men who had spent years screaming about inner wars had to sit across from one another and speak about real emotions. The documentary, Some Kind of Monster, captured this entire period, and what audiences saw was not an invincible empire, but human beings awkwardly confronting themselves. A therapist sat in the recording room. Group therapy sessions were woven between songwriting. Sentences trailed off mid-thought. Silences stretched longer than the music itself. For the first time, the public saw James without total control. Not because he was weaker, but because the old armor no longer fit the new reality. Saint Anger was born in that context. Its sound was raw, unpolished. The drums struck dry and rigid. The guitars lacked their usual sheen. For many, it was a controversial release, but looked at more closely, it resembles an honest record of chaos, unrefined, unhidden. Anger had once helped James build an empire. It helped him stand after the death of a close friend. It helped him lead the band through decades of storms. But now, that same mechanism was threatening to destroy everything. When anger no longer points outward, it begins to corrode from within. And for the first time, James Hetfield was forced to confront the possibility that his greatest strength might also be his deepest weakness. When James Hetfield left rehab, there was no victory moment waiting for him. No lights, no cheers. Only a bare reality. The world outside was the same, but he could no longer live the way he used to. The hardest part was not quitting alcohol. It was staying with his emotions, sober, unshielded, without shortcuts. The first changes happened where few people could see them. James began setting boundaries with the very work that had defined his life. Tour time was limited. Cheap breaks were no longer treated as weakness. Family, for the first time, was not something to be sacrificed to keep the machine running. Endurance was no longer measured by how much one could endure until depletion, but by the ability to return while still intact. In the rehearsal room, the atmosphere changed slowly and with difficulty. For Metallica, talking about emotions was not a natural reflex. James, in particular, struggled. For decades, he had communicated through structure, through commands, through control. Now he had to learn to articulate things more ambiguous: fear, insecurity, personal limits. The first sentences were hesitant, fragmented, but that very awkwardness revealed something that had never existed before: genuine presence. In public, James also began speaking differently. In interviews, he no longer wore the role of the invulnerable figure. He acknowledged the fragility of recovery, acknowledged the fear of relapse. He acknowledged that there were days when he was not okay, and that this did not need to be hidden. For someone who had built an image on absolute toughness, this was a risky retreat. But it was also a necessary step forward. The music reflected that shift in more subtle ways. The Day That Never Comes was not written as an immediate explosion. It unfolds slowly. It accumulates. It carries the weary sense of waiting within a cycle that has not yet ended. Anger is still there. but it no longer dominates the structure. It is placed within the context of memory, of self-observation, of wounds being faced directly rather than pushed outward. Most importantly, James did not try to erase anger. He learned how to manage it. Instead of letting it define every reaction, he began to recognize it as a signal, an emotion, not a command. Instead of issuing orders, he practiced saying, "I feel." Instead of controlling others, he learned to control the rhythm of his own life. See, this new language was not powerful in the old way, but it was more sustainable. This change did not make Metallica weaker. It allowed the band to continue without self-destruction. And for James Hetfield, it offered a different definition of strength. Not the ability to scream louder than everyone else, but the ability to stay with himself, even when there is no scream left to drown out what is happening inside. As Metallica entered its 4th decade of existence, there was nothing left to prove. Stadiums were still filled. Old songs still rang out like ritual. But the center of gravity had shifted. The weight no longer lay in conquering anyone else. It lay in maintaining presence without losing oneself. At the heart of this phase stood James Hetfield, a man no longer defined by rage. Anger still existed as part of his creative instinct, but it was no longer his public identity. James no longer needed to scream to assert his place. He stood on stage with a new calm, like someone who understood the origin of the very energy that once controlled him. That change did not come from forgetting the past. It came from facing it. James began speaking openly about childhood wounds, the silence, the losses, the emotional rules that had shaped his reflexes for decades. What had once been tightly compressed was now named, not to assign blame, but to understand. Not to rewrite history, but to avoid being controlled by it. In 2019, when James publicly acknowledged a relapse and returned to treatment, the public response was no longer shock or suspicion. It was understanding. By then, the story was no longer about the sudden collapse of an icon. It was part of a long recovery journey, one where progress is never linear. Admitting relapse did not make James weaker. It reinforced one truth. Honesty now mattered more than image. James Hetfield's legacy, therefore, cannot be measured solely by riffs or albums. It lies in allowing audiences to witness his process of growth in real time. From a man raised in silence, who learned to survive through anger, to someone who gradually learned how to live with emotion without armor. Metallica remains a great metal band, but James Hetfield has become something rarer, a human being willing to grow up in public. And in a world where strength is often mistaken for invulnerability, his greatest legacy may not lie in never falling, but in daring to stand back up again and again without pretending he was never wounded. James Hetfield grew up in silence. Not the kind of silence that is peaceful, but the silence of repression, where emotions are never named, where pain must erase itself so that belief can remain intact. In that world, the boy James learned how to survive by not feeling too much. When music appeared, anger became the first language he could use. He built Metallica with that energy, with anger that was organized, disciplined, and turned into structure. It took him very far enough to become the biggest metal band in the world. But that very defense mechanism nearly took everything away. when anger could no longer be released through music, when control became a burden, when silence returned in another form. James was forced to confront the question he had avoided his entire life. What changed was not the music. Metallica is still loud, still heavy, still ferocious. What changed was the inner language. James Hetfield no longer only shouts, "Yeah!" to lead a crowd. He learned how to say, "I'm not okay." To the band, to the public, and to himself. And perhaps the greatest thing James Hetfield has ever done was not building the biggest metal band in the world. Not the riffs that became history, not the sold-out stadiums, but learning how to feel. After having built everything that once existed, so he would not have to feel at all. This is not a story about perfection. It is the story of a human being who finally allowed himself to be human. So if you believe that legends are not only shaped by stage lights, but also by the quiet battles within, follow Icons and Legacies. Here, we don't just talk about success. We explore what happens after success, after the scream, after the applause. Because sometimes, the greatest story of an artist is not how they conquer the world, but how they learn to live with themselves. Subscribe to continue the journey of discovering the people behind the legends.